It was a morning like any other. The soft light of early dawn stretched through the curtains, gently illuminating the cozy home where Jake Henderson had lived with his wife Mia and their 2-year-old daughter. Outside, the birds chirped lazily as though nothing was amiss in the world. The house hummed with the quiet sounds of a waking family. Mia's soft footsteps in the kitchen, the whir of the coffee machine as she prepared Jake's favorite blend. The comforting routine of the morning was a refuge for them, a momentary pause in the busyness of life. Jake had always been the quiet, dependable sort, the kind of man who found solace in the simple things. His job at the office, his family, the football games he watched on lazy Sunday afternoons, and the walks he'd take around the neighborhood. There was a steady calm about him that Mia had always admired, the kind of calm that grounded her, kept her anchored when life seemed overwhelming. But that morning, something felt different. Jake, as usual, came down the stairs just as Mia was finishing his coffee. His footsteps echoed lightly through the hallway. When he entered the kitchen, there was the faintest shadow of weariness in his eyes, something Mia hadn't seen before. "Good morning, babe," he said, his voice soft and tired. He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Mia hadn't thought much of it at the time. He was probably just tired from the long week, she thought. They both were. The hectic pace of their lives had worn them thin, the pressures of work, parenting, and trying to maintain some semblance of relationship taking their toll. Still, despite the tiredness, there was a sense of normalcy that made everything feel as if it would always be this way. "I made your favorite," she said, setting down a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. "You should have gone to bed earlier last night. You're burning the candle at both ends." He chuckled softly, his eyes scanning her face for a brief moment. "I know. I'll get better at it. Just a few more weeks, and things will slow down at work. Promise." Mia nodded, though she wasn't convinced. They had said the same thing to each other countless times before. In the early years of their marriage, the idea of work taking over had seemed distant. They had talked about their future, about how things would get easier as time went on. But now, as they sat in the kitchen together, it felt like something was shifting, something they hadn't yet fully grasped. Jake was restless. He looked at his watch and stood up suddenly, wiping his mouth with a napkin. He had always been punctual, always ready to dive into the next task of the day. But today, his movements were sharper, almost impatient. "I've got to head out," he said, his voice holding a note of finality. Mia watched him gather his things, the small movements of his hands betraying a tension that hadn't been there before. She felt a pang of concern, but dismissed it quickly. Maybe he was just running late. He had a big meeting scheduled, and there were always deadlines. The weight of their responsibilities often took a toll, and Jake had always been the one to shoulder it quietly. "I'll see you tonight," he said, offering a smile that didn't quite match his usual warmth. Mia reached for him, her hand brushing his arm as he turned to leave. There was a moment, a brief hesitation where their gazes locked. For a heartbeat, it felt like time itself had paused. Jake looked at her, a shadow of something unspoken flickering in his eyes. Mia didn't know it then, but that fleeting moment would be the last time she would see him like that, the last time she would feel the weight of his presence so close. "I love you," she said, her voice tender. Jake paused in the doorway, turning back toward her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Love you too," he replied. His words were light, but there was a hidden weight behind them, something she couldn't place. And then, just like that, he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, and for a few seconds, the house felt eerily quiet. Mia stood there for a moment longer than usual, her fingers lingering on the coffee cup as she stared at the empty space where Jake had just been. The house seemed different now, more empty, colder somehow, but she shook the feeling off. It was just her mind playing tricks on her. It was a busy day ahead. After all, there was a list of things to get done, the usual chaos that came with caring for their daughter, Lily. She moved on with her day, making breakfast for Lily and getting her ready for daycare, all the while trying to push the unsettling feeling from her mind. There was something about Jake's demeanor, something small and insignificant yet profound, that lingered in the air. But she chalked it up to stress. It had been a long week, after all. As the hours passed, Mia went about her routine, tidying up the house, getting a few things done before picking up Lily. The minutes ticked by, and still there was no word from Jake. That wasn't unusual. He often got caught up in meetings or lost track of time while at work. But the feeling that something was wrong only seemed to grow stronger. Around noon, she called him, as she always did. But this time, the call went straight to voicemail. She waited a moment before trying again, and then again. The uneasy feeling in her chest grew with each unanswered call. She left a message, trying to stay calm. "Hey, just checking in. Hope everything's okay. Call me when you get a chance." Mia went about the afternoon in a haze. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As she picked up Lily and returned home, her thoughts were clouded with doubt. Jake had always been so dependable, so reliable. But now, there was a gnawing feeling in her gut, a persistent whisper that something had gone wrong. When the evening came, there was still no word from him. No call, no text, not even a simple "I'm running late." She tried calling again, her fingers trembling as she dialed. The call rang out once, twice, 3 times before it went to voicemail. She left another message, her voice shaking more than she cared to admit. "Jake, where are you? What's going on? You're worrying me." By now, the feeling in her chest had twisted into something darker, something heavier. She told herself to calm down. It was probably nothing. He was fine. He had to be. But her mind refused to let go of the images of him leaving the house that morning, his quick movements, the strange look in his eyes. And now the silence. She told herself she was overthinking it. He would walk through the door any minute now, smiling with that familiar grin, apologizing for running late. But the door didn't open. The house stayed quiet. The minutes dragged on, the clock ticking louder and louder in the empty space. Hours passed. The phone remained silent. Jake didn't come home. By midnight, Mia's worry had transformed into something else. Panic, fear. The knots in her stomach twisted tighter as she paced around the house, checking the door once again, as if he might just appear out of nowhere. But he didn't. The silence was suffocating. Her heart began to race. Something had happened. Something was wrong. Mia tried to convince herself that it was just a delay, that he was caught up in something, maybe stuck at work. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. She could feel in her bones a gut-deep certainty that Jake was gone. He wasn't coming back. The house, which had once been filled with the warmth of their love, now felt like a prison. And as the night wore on, Mia sat on the couch, staring at her phone, willing it to ring. But the silence remained. She didn't know it yet, but that was the last time she would see him. That was the last time she would hear his voice, see his smile. And as the hours stretched into the next morning, Mia would find herself facing a mystery that would tear apart everything she thought she knew about the man she had married and about herself. The sun had long since set when Mia finally allowed herself to admit something she hadn't wanted to acknowledge all day. Jake wasn't coming home. The first few hours had been filled with the usual distractions. Lily's bedtime routine, the hum of the television, and the constant checking her phone, as if willing it to ring. But by midnight, the silence in the house had become unbearable, and the weight of the unknown pressed down on her chest. She sat in the dim glow of the living room, her knees pulled up to her chest, staring at the phone in her hands as if it might somehow spring to life. She had checked the battery, 100%. The signal was strong. Nothing, not even a text, not a word. She couldn't remember a time when Jake had ever been this unreachable. The uncertainty gnawed at her, deeper and deeper with every passing second. It was unlike him. He always called if he was running late. He always let her know if something came up. Even on the busiest days, he would send a quick message, a brief, "I'm okay, I'll be home soon," just to reassure her. But tonight, nothing. Mia's pulse quickened as she pulled herself from the couch and paced back and forth across the room. She kept glancing at the clock, as though seeing the time ticking away might somehow help her make sense of this growing sense of dread. By now, the sense of worry had already begun to morph into something far more ominous, a feeling she couldn't quite name, but that she knew deep down was as real as the air she breathed. It wasn't just the unanswered calls or the long silence. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that something had shifted, something broken, and Jake, her husband, the man she had loved and trusted, was at the center of it. She called him again. The screen lit up as it rang, and the sound seemed to echo in the room, magnifying the emptiness that had already settled there. The call went on for a few seconds before it was met with a familiar sound of the voicemail greeting. Mia's heart lurched in her chest as she quickly pressed end and redialed. She could feel her breath hitching in her throat as she repeated the process, over and over again, as though each attempt might be the one to break the silence. "Come on, Jake," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling slightly. She could hear the faint beeping of the voicemail box each time, and with every unanswered call, the fear within her grew. She tried to steady her thoughts, to find some semblance of calm, but it was as if her mind was unraveling, spiraling with every unanswered ring. The images of him leaving the house earlier that day, his rushed departure, his distant eyes, seemed to replay over and over again in her head. She tried again, feeling the slight tremble in her fingers as she pressed call. The phone rang, and rang, and rang. It went to voicemail again, the same impersonal message, the one that had played so many times before in moments when they had both forgotten to turn the ringer on or had gone out for errands. But tonight, it felt different, so much different. Her breathing grew shallow as she left another message, her words stumbling out before she even realized what she was saying. "Jake, what's going on? Where are you? This isn't funny. It's late. I'm getting worried. Please just call me back. I need to know you're okay." The message was left in a hurry, a frantic call for reassurance she didn't even realize she was desperate for. But deep down, she knew this wasn't just about a missed phone call anymore. It was about something else, something far darker that hovered at the edges of her thoughts, waiting to be realized. She sat down on the couch again, phone clutched tightly in her hands, waiting. She didn't know what she was waiting for. Maybe for Jake to finally answer, to walk through the door, or even just to send a text. But nothing came. The minutes turned to hours, and with each passing one, Mia's mind filled with worse possibilities. She kept telling herself that it was probably nothing. Maybe he'd just gone out for a drink with friends. Or maybe something had come up at work. He would be fine. He had to be fine. But the more she tried to convince herself, the more her imagination wandered into places she couldn't bear to go. What if something had happened to him? What if he had been in an accident? What if he'd been taken? Mia's mind spiraled with the endless what-ifs, each one darker than the last. By 2 a.m., Mia couldn't sit still anymore. She stood up, the cool floor against her feet, grounding her just for a moment. She grabbed her jacket off the back of the chair and pulled it on, as though the physical movement would somehow give her control over the suffocating panic that was starting to rise in her chest. She stepped outside into the cold night air, the quiet streets stretching out before her, empty and uninviting. Mia's footsteps echoed in the darkness as she walked down the sidewalk, trying to collect herself, trying to figure out where to go, what to do. She had considered calling the police, but it seemed too early, too premature. Jake had only been gone for a handful of hours. Nothing about this felt like an emergency, not yet. Still, the hollow weight of dread pressed heavily on her chest, and the longer she walked, the more her thoughts felt out of control. Where would he be at this hour? Where would he go without telling her, without checking in? There were so many places she had never considered, places he had never mentioned, and now, the quiet anonymity of the night seemed to amplify the endless unknowns. As she turned the corner, Mia noticed a car parked down the street, an unfamiliar vehicle that seemed out of place in their neighborhood. Her heart skipped a beat. She walked closer, her feet heavy on the concrete. The car was black, sleek, and nondescript, parked on the side of the road with the headlights dimmed. It didn't feel right. Nothing felt right. She stood there for a moment, staring at the car, trying to think, trying to push the mounting fear down. Was Jake inside, talking to someone? Was he hiding something from her? Could he be in trouble? The more she thought about it, the more the idea that Jake might be in some kind of trouble made sense. It was the only explanation that could fit the mounting tension. If he was fine, why hadn't he called her back? Why hadn't he come home by now? Why did she feel this sense of impending doom in the pit of her stomach? She turned on her heel and hurried back toward the house, feeling the cold rush of air on her face, her mind racing. She tried to force herself to think rationally. She couldn't let fear take over. She needed to be calm, to think logically, but it was becoming harder and harder to ignore the gut feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. She returned to the house and immediately checked her phone again, her pulse hammering in her throat. Nothing. The silence was deafening. Mia was about to call him again when her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the doorbell ringing. Her heart skipped a beat, but when she opened the door, there was no one there. Just a faint, almost imperceptible breeze. She stepped back into the house, more confused than ever, as if the universe itself was mocking her. It was then that Mia made the decision. She couldn't wait any longer. The fear, the unease, the unanswered questions, they were all too much. She needed to find Jake. She needed to understand why he hadn't come home. She needed to see him, to talk to him, to hear his voice. With one last desperate look at the phone, she grabbed her jacket and headed for the car. The night was still, the stars barely visible through the thick clouds, but Mia's thoughts were a storm. As she drove through the empty streets, each intersection felt like another crossing into an unknown territory she couldn't navigate alone. Mia was no longer just waiting for Jake to come back. She was now hunting for him, driven by an instinct that was both powerful and terrifying. The world outside felt more foreign than ever. The quiet hum of the city's lights a stark contrast to the wild. Panic thoughts racing in her mind. She had no idea where to go. She had no idea what to look for. But she had to try, because the longer she waited, the harder it became to deny the truth. Jake was missing, and there was no guarantee that he would ever come back. Mia's mind felt like it was fracturing the days that followed Jake's disappearance. The first few hours had been filled with frantic calls, unanswered messages, and the hope that somehow, somewhere, there would be a simple explanation. But as the days wore on, the silence that surrounded Jake's absence began to feel more and more suffocating. It was as if the universe had conspired to strip away every shred of certainty, leaving only the disorienting haze of fear and confusion. There were no answers, no comforting words, only the endless gnawing of what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. Mia spent the next day in a fog, her body moving through the motions of daily life, while her mind refused to leave the haunting reality that Jake was gone. She got Lily ready for daycare, as if it was any other morning, but the routine felt foreign. How could she act like everything was normal when Jake, the man who had always been there by her side, was now nowhere to be found? The morning was punctuated by a constant urge to check her phone, as if it might suddenly buzz with a text or a missed call. Some sign that Jake had been there all along, that this was all just a misunderstanding, a bad dream. When Mia dropped Lily off, she went to work, but her thoughts were a blur. The calls to the police, the endless cycle of unanswered messages, all felt so futile. Each time the phone rang, her heart leapt into her throat, only for the disappointment to wash over her when it wasn't Jake on the other end. She had gone through the motions of reporting him missing, but something in her gut told her that the authorities weren't as concerned as they should be. They had asked the usual questions, taken the standard notes, and offered the expected reassurances that they would look into it. But Mia knew in her bones that they didn't understand. They didn't feel the urgency, the weight of what this meant for her. How could they? They didn't know Jake the way she did. They didn't know what he was capable of, what he was hiding. By the time the evening rolled around, Mia's stomach was in knots. She had called the police again, hoping for any shred of progress, but they still didn't have anything new to tell her. They couldn't find any trace of him. No leads, no sightings. It was as if Jake had vanished into thin air. That night, she sat in front of the television, but nothing on the screen could hold her attention. The static buzz of the newscasters, the irrelevant chatter of sitcom characters, all of it felt hollow, meaningless, and distant. The quiet of the house was deafening, each second that passed like an eternity. She kept trying to tell herself that this was just a delay, that Jake had just gotten caught up in something, maybe a late-night meeting or a conversation with someone he'd met along the way. But as the minutes stretched into hours, that small voice in the back of her head began to grow louder, telling her that this was something far worse. At some point, Mia had stopped crying. The tears had run dry, replaced by a cold, gnawing sense of dread that clung to her like a second skin. She couldn't understand it, couldn't make sense of it. She tried to tell herself that Jake was fine, that he would walk through the door at any moment, and everything would go back to normal. But deep down she knew that this wasn't normal. This wasn't just another one of his late nights. This wasn't an ordinary argument or misunderstanding. Jake was gone, and every second that passed without word from him was a sharp, painful reminder of that fact. The next morning, Mia's resolve hardened. She wasn't going to wait for the police to find answers. She couldn't. She couldn't just sit back and let time slip away while Jake remained out there somewhere, alone and possibly in danger. She needed to act, needed to find him herself. It was the only way. She couldn't shake the feeling that the clock was ticking, and the longer she waited, the more difficult it would become to unravel the mystery of what had happened to him. She began retracing Jake's steps. Tried to think of anywhere he might have gone or anyone he might have talked to before he disappeared. She couldn't rely on the police. She couldn't rely on anyone but herself. Her mind was sharp, focused, relentless. She spent hours going to the places Jake frequented, asking questions of people who might have seen him. She went to the grocery store, the gas station, the coffee shop he visited every morning on his way to work, trying to find someone, anyone, who had seen him in the hours before he disappeared. But it was all a dead end. No one had seen anything unusual. No one had anything to offer her. Mia's desperation grew as the hours turned into days. The fear that had once been a whisper at the back of her mind now consumed her entirely. She wasn't just searching for answers anymore. She was fighting against a rising tide of uncertainty, grasping at anything that might offer her a hint of where Jake had gone, why he had left, and most importantly, why he hadn't come back. As the investigation stretched on, Mia began to question the very fabric of their relationship. She had always known Jake as a quiet man, someone who kept his feelings to himself, someone who avoided conflict at all costs. But this was something different. She couldn't reconcile the man she knew with the man who had vanished without a trace. Had she missed something? Had she ignored signs that pointed to trouble? The idea that Jake had been hiding something from her began to take root in her mind. She thought about the late nights at the office, the times he seemed distant, the way he had become increasingly withdrawn in the months leading up to his disappearance. What if he had been living a double life, keeping secrets from her that she hadn't seen or understood? Her thoughts spiraled, and every new theory she considered seemed to only deepen the mystery. Had he been involved in something dangerous? Had he been coerced into doing something he didn't want to do? The idea of Jake being involved with people or organizations she didn't know about was too much for her to process. But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. The nagging feeling, the tension that had begun to seep into their relationship. It was all starting to connect. Had he been trying to protect her, or had he been trying to escape? As the days passed, Mia's obsession grew. The search for Jake consumed her entirely. It wasn't just about finding him anymore. It was about finding out the truth, about peeling back the layers of their life together and seeing what had been hidden beneath. She wasn't sure what she was hoping for anymore. Maybe she just wanted closure. Maybe she wanted to believe that Jake was still alive, still out there, somewhere, waiting to come home. But there was a part of her that feared what she might find. Mia found herself questioning everything she thought she knew. She began to wonder if she had ever truly known Jake at all. The man she had married, the man she had built a life with, seemed like a stranger now, a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit together. Every new lead, every new bit of information, seemed to push her further away from a man she thought she knew, leaving her to face the possibility that maybe the Jake she had spent the last several years with wasn't the man she thought he was. The emotional toll of the search was becoming unbearable. Mia had spent countless hours driving through the streets, knocking on doors, talking to strangers, trying to make sense of the unspeakable. She had never felt more alone in her life. The house, once filled with the laughter of her family, was now hollow and empty. She tried to reach out to friends, to family, but it felt like no one understood the depth of her fear, her grief, her desperation. The police were doing their best, but Mia couldn't help but feel as though they were moving at a crawl, while every moment that passed was another moment she might never get back. Her mind was a labyrinth of confusion and pain. She wasn't just searching for Jake. She was searching for answers to a question she didn't even know how to ask. What had happened to him? Why had he disappeared? Had he chosen to leave, or had something forced him to go? As the days turned into weeks, Mia's one strong resolve began to fracture. She could feel herself unraveling, piece by piece. The search for Jake had turned into a battle against her own sanity. The harder she searched, the less she understood. And with every unanswered call, every new dead end, the more she realized just how little she knew about the man she had spent so many years with. Was it possible to live with someone for so long and still not truly know them? What if the man she thought she knew wasn't the man she had married at all? The search for Jake had become a search for herself. She had no idea where this would end or what she would find when it did. But one thing was certain. The woman she was before Jake disappeared was no longer the same person standing here now. The discovery of Jake's backpack hit Mia like a physical blow. It wasn't supposed to be this way. It couldn't be. But there it was, a sharp, undeniable piece of evidence that twisted the knife of uncertainty deeper into her chest. It wasn't just a personal belonging. It was a relic, an anchor to a reality that seemed more and more like a nightmare each passing day. Jake's backpack, the one he had used every day, packed with his laptop, work papers, and small, familiar things that made up the rhythm of his daily life. The backpack had been found in an abandoned alley, left as if someone had carelessly discarded it. And Mia, standing in the dim light of the police station when the news came in, couldn't help but feel the weight of it. It was wrong. All of it was wrong. The backpack, the location, the circumstances, nothing about this made sense. The police had called her in as soon as they found it, asking if she recognized it. She didn't need to be asked. There was no mistaking it. She could see the slight fraying at the zipper, the way the fabric was slightly worn at the edges from the years of use. It was his. It was Jake's. She had driven to the scene, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, as if somehow holding on to the wheel would hold on to some semblance of control. But the closer she got to the location where the backpack had been found, the more the knot in her stomach tightened. An alley, abandoned and forgotten, seemed to be a poor place for the personal effects of someone she had known so well. How had it ended up there? The police had already marked off the area with yellow tape, and their flashlights cast long shadows on the dirty walls of the alley as Mia stepped out of her car. They greeted her somberly but didn't say much. There was nothing left to say. The discovery of the backpack was both a relief and a new burden. On one hand, it meant Jake was still somehow part of the story. But on the other hand, it only deepened the mystery. Why had it been left there? Why was it abandoned so carelessly, like someone had dropped it in haste? Mia took a few shaky steps toward the officers standing near the scene. One of them, a young detective with a kind but tired face, motioned for her to approach. "We found this about an hour ago, ma'am. We're still going over the area for more evidence, but we thought you should see it." Mia nodded, her throat tight. She couldn't bring herself to speak. Not yet. She just reached out and gently ran her fingers over the strap of the backpack, as if she were trying to connect with Jake through the fabric. It was surreal. How could it have ended up here, in this dark, forgotten place? It felt like a cruel joke. A part of her wanted to scream at the officers, to demand to know what they were doing, to ask why they weren't finding more, doing more. But she couldn't bring herself to break down in front of them. Not yet. Instead, her fingers shook as she opened the flap of the backpack, her heart racing. Inside, there were few familiar items. His laptop, the one he always carried to work, a notebook with scribbled notes, half-finished ideas for reports. She almost laughed at the sight of the half-drunk bottle of water tucked inside, the kind Jake always carried with him on his long days. But there was something more. Tucked in the corner of the bag was a torn piece of paper. Her fingers froze when she saw it. A note. It was small, tore at the edges, and the handwriting was hurried, messy, as though it had been written in a panic. She pulled it out gently, her eyes scanning the words in the dim light. "I'm sorry. I'll be back soon. I hope you understand." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her breath caught in her throat. The note was so simple, so innocent at first glance, but there was something deeply wrong about it. The torn edges, the rushed nature of the words. It felt like a message that had been left in haste, as though someone had wanted to say something but couldn't find the time or the space to finish it. And Mia felt the full weight of it settle into her chest. "I'll be back soon," the note read. The words were so casual, so familiar, and yet they held a weight that Mia couldn't fully comprehend. Was he coming back? Was this a promise? Or was it an apology? A last farewell? Her mind raced with the implications, each thought darker and more disturbing than the last. What had happened to Jake? Where had he gotten himself into that had led to this moment, this forsaken alley, this cryptic note? She could feel her heart racing in her chest as she held the note, as if the words themselves were alive, pulsing with the ghost of Jake. Mia looked around at the officers, but none of them seemed to understand the gravity of what was unfolding before them. They were still treating this like any other missing person case. But it wasn't like any other case. This was Jake, and the note was proof of something that was beginning to unravel in the pit of her stomach. "I need to know what happened," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. The detective glanced at her sympathetically, but the words that came out of his mouth felt empty. "We'll find out, Mrs. Henderson. We'll follow the leads. We're doing everything we can." His voice was gentle, but Mia could see the doubt in his eyes. They didn't know. They didn't understand the depth of what was happening. How could they? How could they know that every second Jake was missing felt like a knife in her side, twisting deeper and deeper? She clutched the note to her chest, trying to steady herself. The weight of it pressed down on her, suffocating her. There had to be more. There had to be something she was missing. The backpack, the note, this wasn't just a random accident. This was deliberate. Jake had left it behind for a reason. He had wanted her to find it. But why? Why would he leave such a thing behind? If he had been running, if he had been in danger, why wouldn't he have taken it with him? Why had he left it in an alley, as if abandoning it was the only option left to him? The questions twisted in her mind, each one pulling her deeper into the mystery. She could feel the knot tightening in her stomach as she stood there in the alley, staring at the backpack. Everything that had happened in the last few days, the unanswered calls, the unspoken tension, was starting to add up to something far darker than she had been willing to acknowledge. It wasn't just that Jake had gone missing. It was what he had left behind, what he had been hiding, that scared her more than anything else. The officers didn't have much more to say. They told her they would continue their search, that they would investigate the area further, but it was clear that they were just as lost as she was. Mia wasn't sure if they even understood what this meant. The note, the backpack, they weren't just physical objects. They were pieces of a puzzle that Mia couldn't yet put together. But she knew one thing with certainty that shook her to the core. Jake hadn't just disappeared. He had left on his own terms, for reasons she didn't understand, and it was up to her to figure out why. She left the alley with the backpack clutched in her hands, the note still pressed against her chest. The weight of it was unbearable, and yet it was the only clue she had. Every step she took felt like a step into the unknown, and Mia couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking down a path that would lead her to something she wasn't prepared for. Back at the house, Mia spread the contents of the backpack out on the kitchen table, examining everything carefully. She tried to find something that might give her more information, some hidden message Jake had left for her. The laptop seemed too mundane, too ordinary to hold any clues, but it was the only thing that felt tethered to Jake's real life. She powered it on, but nothing stood out. No strange emails. No mysterious messages. It was just his work, his usual tasks and notes, a reflection of the man she thought she knew. But the note, the torn note, kept returning to her mind. "I'll be back soon." Those words rang in her ears, echoing with a sense of finality that she didn't want to face. She couldn't help but feel like she was missing something. Something vital. Something hidden beneath the surface of this ordinary scene. As she stared at the note again, the pieces slowly began to shift, and for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder. Was Jake telling her the truth? Or was he trying to tell her something far darker? Something she wasn't yet ready to understand? Mia felt a chill crawl up her spine as the answers seemed to slip just out of reach. The note, the backpack, Jake's disappearance. It was all part of the story she hadn't yet begun to unravel, and the more she thought about it, the more it became clear. She was the only one who could piece it together, the only one who could bring the truth to light. But at what cost? And would she even be ready to face it when she did? Days turned into a blur for Mia. What started as an ordinary, albeit worrying, search for her missing husband had become an all-consuming, frantic quest for the truth. The backpack and the torn note had raised more questions than they answered, and each step she took seemed to pull her deeper into an abyss that she wasn't sure she was prepared for. The world outside seemed to have gone on as usual, indifferent to the disaster unfolding in her life. While she was trapped in an endless loop of searching, questioning, and fearing, the city carried on. The streets, the people, the clocks, they all kept moving, ticking by, while her entire universe seemed frozen in a moment of waiting, of hoping that Jake would come back. But with each passing day, the hope grew more distant, the waiting more unbearable. The police had continued their investigation, of course, but Mia couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't looking hard enough. She could see the way they spoke to her, the way they reassured her, but their words fell hollow. They hadn't seen what she had seen. They hadn't found a backpack, held a note, or felt the cold emptiness that had settled into her soul. They didn't know Jake like she did. They didn't understand that his disappearance wasn't just a random incident. It was part of something bigger, something hidden just beneath the surface. The note had haunted her more than anything else. She couldn't stop thinking about it. The handwriting, the rushed, almost desperate tone. "I'll be back soon," it said, as though Jake had intended to return. But soon didn't mean anything. Soon was a vague promise, a thin thread of hope, and Mia clung to it like a lifeline, even though deep down, she knew it might snap at any moment. Mia had taken a note to work with her the next day, desperate to find someone, anyone, who could make sense of it. But there was no one. She had sat in her cubicle, staring at the words, trying to decipher their meaning, to understand why Jake had left us behind for her find. She felt like she was chasing a ghost, trying to catch glimpses of Jake in every detail, every possible clue. But there was nothing. She kept asking herself, why? What had Jake gotten involved in? What had he been hiding from her? The questions gnawed at her, a constant presence, a weight she couldn't shake. At night, she would lie awake in bed, her thoughts running wild. She tried to imagine what Jake had been going through in the days before his disappearance. Was he scared? Had something happened to him? Was there a reason why he couldn't reach out to her? Was he running from something? Or had he just disappeared on his own, intentionally severing all ties, leaving everything behind? The uncertainty was unbearable. The not knowing, the empty space where he should have been, where his laughter should have echoed to the rooms of their home. And yet, despite the pain, despite the fear, Mia kept searching. She refused to stop. There was no other option. She had to find Jake. She had to understand what had happened to him. The idea of him out there, alone and perhaps in danger, was a constant, suffocating presence that she couldn't escape. Her search led her down countless dead ends. She visited all the places Jake had gone to in the days before he vanished. His office, the coffee shop, the park where they used to walk together on weekends. She spoke to his friends, his co-workers, his neighbors, anyone who might have seen or heard anything. But no one knew anything. No one had seen him. No one had heard from him. It was as if he had just fallen off the face of the earth. His disappearance was a hole in the fabric of her life, and no matter how hard she searched, she couldn't stitch it back together. Mia couldn't understand it. How could Jake, the man she'd shared everything with, simply vanish? How could he leave her without a trace, without so much as a word? The more she asked herself these questions, the more distant the answers seemed. She was no closer to finding the truth, no closer to understanding what had happened to him. And then, one evening, something shifted. It was a phone call, and it came at the most unexpected moment. Mia was sitting on the couch, the room bathed in the dim glow of a lamp, when her phone rang. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the number on the screen. It was an unknown number, not one she recognized. 1,000 thoughts flashed through her mind, each one darker than the last. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering over the screen. Could it be Jake? Had he somehow gotten a hold of the phone? Or was it the police calling with new information? With trembling hands, she answered the call. Mia Henderson? The voice on the other end was deep, rough, and unfamiliar. "Yes, who's this?" she asked, her voice tight with mixture of hope and suspicion. "My name is Jason. I'm someone who knew your husband." Mia's heart pounded in her chest. Her thoughts whirled, and she barely heard the next few words as they tumbled out his mouth. He told her he had information about Jake, information that could help her find him. The words felt like a lifeline, but at the same time, they felt like a trap. Who was this person? Why had they waited so long to reach out to her? Jason explained that he had been close to Jake. Someone from his past who had known him before Mia had entered the picture. He hadn't wanted to get involved, he said, but now he felt it was time to talk. The urgency in his voice was palpable, and Mia's mind raced. Why now? Why after all this time? Jason told her to meet him at a nearby diner, a place he knew Jake had frequented in the past. He insisted that he had critical information, that he could help her find her husband. But he was nervous, hesitant, like someone who was afraid of what would happen when the truth finally came to light. Mia agreed to meet him. She had to. This could be the lead she had been waiting for, the thread that would pull the whole story together. The diner was old, its neon sign flickering in the dark, casting an eerie glow on the empty street outside. The air was thick with the smell of fried food and stale coffee. The waitress behind the counter looked bored, flipping through a magazine as Mia stepped inside. She had told herself she wouldn't be afraid, that she would keep her emotions in check, but the moment she saw Jason sitting at a booth in the corner, something shifted. He was a tall man, older than Jake by a few years, with sharp features and a nervous energy that reminded me of a man who had been hiding something for far too long. He didn't look at her as she approached. Instead, his eyes were fixed on his coffee cup, his hands wrapped tightly around it. Mia slid into the booth across from him, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew she had to listen. "I know you're looking for Jake," Jason began, his voice low, "and I know you've been searching everywhere, asking everyone. But what I have to say is not going to be easy to hear." Mia's stomach tightened. She hadn't expected it to be easy, but the weight of his words hung in the air like a cloud, thick and oppressive. "Jake! He didn't leave on his own," Jason said, his voice trembling slightly. "There's something you don't know, something he was trying to protect you from. But now, it's time for you to know the truth." Mia leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat. She had waited so long for something, anything, that might explain why Jake had vanished. But the fear in Jason's eyes, the hesitation in his voice, told her this wasn't going to be the simple answer she had hoped for. Jason hesitated for a long time, his gaze flicking nervously toward the door, as if he were afraid someone might be listening. Mia felt the tension building between them, thick and suffocating. "Jake got mixed up in something," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something he couldn't get out of. There are people involved, people he was trying to escape, and they didn't want him to leave. He stopped, his eyes darting around the diner once more, before leaning in closer. "They're the reason he disappeared," he finished, his voice barely audible. Mia's world tilted on its axis. The words hung in the air between them like a noxious cloud. People involved? Escape? Disappear? The questions piled on top of each other, faster than she could process them. She had suspected something was wrong, but this was a revelation she wasn't prepared for. Jason continued, his voice shaky. "Jake didn't just vanish. He was forced into hiding. And now, they know he's been talking to you. They know you're looking for him. And they won't stop until they make sure you never find out the truth." Mia sat frozen, the weight of his words crushing her. She had thought she was searching for Jake, but now it seemed like she had been searching for the truth about everything she had ever known. Mia's entire world seemed to shift with Jason's words, leaving her reeling as if the floor beneath her had cracked open. The sense of disbelief was overwhelming, a physical weight pressing down on her chest as she tried to process what he had just said. She sat there in the dimly lit diner, her hands trembling on the table in front of her, her mind racing with the implications of his revelation. People involved? Forced into hiding? These weren't the answers she had been expecting. And yet, in some way, they felt like the only answers that made any sense. She stared at Jason, searching his face for any hint of deception, any sign that he was lying, but there was nothing. His eyes were wide with fear, his hands clenched tightly around his coffee cup, as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. He wasn't lying. He was scared, and that fear Mia realized was contagious. "So, you're telling me Jake didn't just leave?" Her voice was barely a whisper, thick with disbelief and the crushing weight of a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. Jason took a slow, deep breath, his gaze flickering toward the door again before he leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. No, Mia. Jake didn't leave. He didn't want to go. He was forced into it. There's something big going on, something dangerous, something he didn't want you to get tangled up in. Mia's heart pounded in her chest. Every word that Jason spoke seemed to send her spiraling deeper into a maze of confusion and terror. She had never imagined her life could be so complicated. It had always seemed so simple before. They had been a family, a unit, a life built on trust and love. But now, in the wake of these revelations, everything felt like a lie. Everything she thought she knew about Jake, about their life together, felt false, distorted. Why didn't he tell me? She asked, her voice cracking. Why didn't he tell me any of this? She could feel the tears threatening to rise, the swell of emotion she had been holding back for days now. He left me with nothing, no explanation, no clue, just gone. Jason sighed deeply, rubbing his face with his hands. He seemed to hesitate, as if the words he was about to say were too dangerous, too heavy to bear. But there was no turning back now. He was trying to protect you, Jason said, his voice barely audible. Jake was involved in something he couldn't get out of. He was trying to shield you from it, to keep you safe, but he couldn't. They forced him to disappear. And now, Mia, they know you're looking for him. They know you found the backpack. They're watching you. They'll do whatever it takes to keep you from finding out the truth. Mia felt the blood drain from her face. They're watching you. The words rang in her ears like a death sentence. She had thought she was looking for answers, trying to understand what had happened to Jake. But now, she realized she was part of something much bigger, something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. She wasn't just trying to find her husband. She was stepping into a world of shadows and secrets, a world that could destroy everything she had ever known. The air in the diner felt heavy, oppressive, as if the walls were closing around her. She struggled to breathe, to think, but the weight of it all was suffocating. Who were these people? What had Jake gotten involved in? The questions swirled around in her mind, but there were no answers, only fear, and the sickening realization that Jake had been trying to protect her, to keep her away from whatever mess he had found himself in. But now it was too late. She was already in it. She was already involved, whether she liked it or not. Jason's voice broke through her thoughts, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. Mia, I know this is a lot to take in, but you have to understand, this isn't just about Jake anymore. It's about you. They'll stop at nothing to make sure you don't find out what's really going on. And if they find out you're getting too close, they'll come after you. Mia's mind was reeling. She had felt the weight of the danger hanging over her ever since she had found Jake's backpack. But now, it felt real, tangible, like a looming threat she couldn't escape. She had thought she was just searching for her husband. But this was a war, and she had no idea what side she was on. You don't know these people, Mia, Jason continued, his voice tight with urgency. They're not just some small-time criminals. They're connected, powerful, and Jake got in too deep. He didn't know how to get out, but he was trying to protect you. That's why he disappeared. Mia's thoughts were spinning. Everything Jason was saying made sense, too much sense. The more she thought about it, the more her mind kept returning to the small, torn note she had found in the backpack. I'll be back soon. Jake had been trying to promise her something, even in the midst of whatever chaos he had found himself in. He hadn't just left. He had been forced to leave. But why? What had Jake gotten himself involved in? And why had he waited until it was too late to tell her? Who are these people? She finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What did Jake do? Jason hesitated for a long time, his fingers nervously tapping the side of his cup. He looked around the diner once more, before leaning even closer, as though the very walls might be listening. They're dangerous, he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. Jake got mixed up with some people from his past. People who, well, let's just say they don't play by the rules. He tried to walk away, but they wouldn't let him. And when he decided he had no other choice but to disappear, that's when they made their move. Mia's stomach twisted in knots. The world she had known was unraveling before her eyes. Everything about Jake's disappearance, Every moment that had once seemed inexplicable now had a dark, terrifying explanation. She wasn't just grieving the loss of her husband. She was grieving the loss of the life she thought she had, the life she thought she had built with him, the life that, it seemed, had never been as simple as she believed. "They know about me, don't they?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "These people, they know I'm looking for him. They know about the backpack, and they'll do whatever it takes to stop me." Jason nodded, his expression grim. "Yes, they know, and they'll stop at nothing to keep you from finding Jake. They've already made sure he can't come back. If you keep digging, if you keep looking for answers, they'll come after you. They'll come after anyone who gets too close." Mia felt a chill of terror settle deep in her bones. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, she felt truly afraid, not just for Jake anymore, but for herself. The path she was on had no clear destination, no way out. She had thought she was just trying to find the truth about her husband. But now, the truth felt like a curse, a truth that already ensnared her, pulling her deeper into a world of danger and shadows. But even as the fear coursed through her veins, something else stirred inside her, a sense of determination. She couldn't stop now. She couldn't back down. She had already come this far, and no matter how terrifying the road ahead seemed, she couldn't let it end like this. She had to know what had happened to Jake. She had to understand why he had disappeared. "I'm not going to stop," she said, her voice firm now, more confident than she felt. "I need to know what happened to him. I need to find him." Jason's eyes widened in warning. "Mia, you don't know what you're saying. You have no idea what these people are capable of." "I don't care," she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil swirling inside her. "I need to find him. I don't care what it takes." For a moment, Jason said nothing, his expression one of deep concern. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer now. "I don't know if you understand what you're getting into, but if you're really going to do this, you need to be careful. These people, these connections, they have eyes everywhere. They're always watching." Mia didn't respond. She didn't need to. She already knew the stakes. She already knew that the search for Jake was no longer just a search for her husband. It was a battle against a world that she didn't fully understand, a world she had never wanted to be a part of. But now, there was no turning back. Mia's life had been divided into two distinct realities now. The one she had known before Jason's revelation, and the one she was forced to face now. The one where everything had seemed simple. Her marriage to Jake, their quiet home, their life together, their daughter Lily, their routines. The calm, predictable days had been the foundation of her world. And then there was the other reality, the one where secrets had been buried deep, where Jake had been hiding things from her, things that had pulled him into a dangerous, murky world she could not yet comprehend. She could no longer live in the world she once knew. The innocence, the safety, the everyday moments, they had all been shattered by the weight of Jason's words. And as much as she had wanted to reject them, to pretend that this was all some terrible mistake, some misunderstanding, a part of her knew that the truth was far darker than she had ever imagined. Jake had left her with nothing but the fragile hope of that note. "I'll be back soon." She clung to it like a lifeline, but with each passing day, that hope seemed more and more fragile, fraying at the edges. But now she had no choice. She had to keep moving forward. She had to understand what had happened, why Jake had vanished without a trace, why he had been forced into hiding. She could no longer pretend she didn't know that something larger, far more dangerous, was at play. The days after Jason's meeting felt like a blur of anxiety and fear, as if time itself had warped, speeding up and slowing down in a way that disoriented Mia. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that every corner she turned, every conversation she had, was being observed by unseen eyes. She wasn't sure who or what was watching her, but the paranoia that had begun to creep into her life became unbearable. She couldn't even go grocery shopping without feeling like someone was trailing behind her, following her every move. It was maddening. The safety of her home had been shattered, and the walls that had once shielded her now felt like traps. The first thing Mia did after her conversation with Jason was to dig deeper. She knew she couldn't just take his word for it. She needed more information. She began to comb through every document, every phone record, every scrap of paper Jake had left behind, hoping that some clue would materialize. She was methodical, obsessive even, poring over emails, texts, anything she'd find that might lead her to an understanding of the world Jake had been trying to protect her from. There was nothing obvious, nothing that screamed danger, but as Mia dug deeper into his past, into the things he had done, the places he had gone, there were subtle signs that began to appear. There was a name buried deep in an old email, a person Jake had been emailing just weeks before he disappeared. The name was unfamiliar to Mia, a man by the name of Darren Montgomery. She searched for him online, and what she found only deepened the mystery. There were no social media profiles, no family connections, no personal information that might explain who this person was. Only a trail of scattered news stories about corporate scandals and criminal investigations that didn't seem to lead anywhere. Yet, there was a dark thread woven through everything she found, a connection to powerful people, shadowy figures who operated just out of view, but whose influence was undeniable. Mia didn't know where to go from there. She couldn't just show up at Montgomery's office or try to find him on her own. She had no idea who she was dealing with, what kind of people Jake had gotten himself involved with. The thought of confronting someone like that terrified her, but the fear of doing nothing terrified her more. Mia tried reaching out to Jason again, desperate for any advice or guidance. She had to understand what had happened, and more importantly, she had to know what these people wanted with Jake. If they wanted to keep her from finding out the truth, then they might already be planning their next move. Jason, however, wasn't easy to reach. His number went straight to voicemail, and he never called her back. It made her nervous, more than she wanted to admit. Was he pulling away? Had he been compromised in some way? Or was he just scared? The truth was, she didn't know, but she felt the weight of his absence like a cold hand on her shoulder. The sense of isolation Mia felt grew as she continued her search. She had no one left to trust. Every conversation she had with the police felt like a waste of time. They were just going through the motions, asking the same questions over and over again, offering the same empty reassurances. They weren't taking her seriously, and Mia knew it. They didn't see the bigger picture. They didn't understand what Jake had gotten himself into. One day, while driving to the grocery store, Mia passed the park where she and Jake had often walked together, where they had spent countless afternoons with Lily. It had always been a place of peace, a place where they could escape the stresses of everyday life. But today, as Mia looked at the park, something shifted. She couldn't explain it, but the sight of the swing swaying in the wind, the quiet path leading to the small pond, filled her with dread. It wasn't the park that had changed. It was her. She had changed. And now, this place, once so familiar, felt foreign to her. A symbol of a life she no longer knew how to live. She turned the car around and drove to the small cafe Jake had frequented, the one where he would stop every morning before work to grab coffee. It had become a ritual, a small but comforting part of their routine. The cafe was quiet, almost too quiet, the hum of conversation soft in the background. Mia approached the counter and ordered coffee, her mind still racing with questions, her heart still heavy with grief. She sat down at a table near the window, staring out at the street as she absent-mindedly stirred her drink. The barista, a young woman who had always seemed friendly enough, approached her cautiously, as if sensing that something was off. I remember you, the woman said quietly. You're Jake's wife, right? Mia looked up, startled by the recognition. Yes, I am. Do you know where Jake is? She hadn't planned on asking, but the words spilled out before she could stop herself. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. The woman hesitated for a long moment before speaking again. I don't know where he is, but he came in a few days before he disappeared. He was acting strange, not like himself. He seemed nervous, like he was looking over his shoulder, you know? He didn't want to talk much, just grabbed his coffee and left in a hurry. Mia's breath caught in her throat. Nervous? Jake had always been reserved, but he wasn't someone who got anxious easily. There was something more to it, something that had made him afraid. She asked the woman to describe his behavior in more detail, but she didn't have much more to say. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a chill down Mia's spine. Jake hadn't just vanished. He hadn't simply walked away. He had been running from something, and whatever it was, it had made him fearful enough to change everything about his usual routine. The next few days were a blur. Mia continued to dig deeper into Jake's past, tried to uncover every possible clue, every hidden detail that might explain what had happened. She visited the places Jake had gone to before his disappearance, speaking to anyone who might have known him, hoping for a breakthrough. But every lead she followed seemed to bring her no closer to the truth. The more she learned, the more she realized how little she knew about the man she had married, the man she thought she knew. There were cracks in facade, small ones at first, but now they seemed to be widening, letting in the cold air of uncertainty. Mia had started to feel like a stranger in her own life. She didn't recognize the world she was living in anymore. It felt like everything had been turned upside down. The small, cozy house that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a prison. Every room was filled with reminders of the life she had lost, of the life Jake had stolen away without a trace. She had to know what had happened to him. She had to understand what kind of life he had been living, what kind of danger he had been in. And no matter how dark or twisted the answers might be, she knew she had no choice but to face them. As the days passed, Mia's desperation grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that whatever had happened to Jake was slipping further and further away from her grasp. And if she didn't act soon, she might never get the answers she needed. She was on the edge now, and there was no turning back. The fear, the uncertainty, the isolation, it all felt like it was closing in on her. But somewhere, deep inside, a part of her knew that the only way to survive was to keep moving forward, to keep pushing no matter what it cost. The search for Jake had become the search for herself, and Mia was ready to uncover the truth, no matter how dangerous or unsettling it might be. Mia's resolve grew even stronger as she moved through the days that followed. The world around her felt heavier, as though it were pressing down on her every step. But she couldn't stop now. She couldn't stop looking, couldn't stop searching for Jake. The fragment of information Jason had given her had opened the door to something far darker than she had been prepared to face. And yet, the door had already been opened, and she had no choice but to walk through it. The weight of the unknown was suffocating, but the thought of stopping, of leaving the pieces of Jake's disappearance scattered without answers, was unbearable. She spent every waking hour combing through every piece of information she could find, digging into the past that Jake had kept hidden from her. She reached out to people he had known before, old friends, colleagues, even ex-business partners. She tracked down anyone who might have known something, even if it was just a small detail that might explain why he had disappeared, why he had run. Everyone she spoke to seemed distant, uncertain, or unwilling to talk. The veil around Jake's life had been thick, and now that she was tearing at it, she could see the shadows moving beneath. The name Darren Montgomery continued to linger in her mind. He was the key. She was sure of it. But as she continued to dig, she found that Montgomery was almost impossible to track down. There were no social media profiles, no public records beyond a few scattered news stories about corporate lawsuits and shady dealings. It was as though he didn't exist, and yet Mia knew he was connected to everything. There had to be something, some trail she could follow that would lead her to him. The more she searched, the more fragmented Jake's life seemed to become. It was as though the person she had shared her life with had been a stranger. She'd known him, loved him, but there were parts of him that had been hidden, parts that were now coming to the surface in the most unsettling ways. As she sifted through his old emails, his personal files, she started to piece together a disturbing picture. Jake had been involved in something far bigger than she had ever imagined. There were conversations, coded messages, hints of deals and negotiations that seemed to center around people Mia couldn't even name. These weren't the kind of things someone who had a quiet life with a family should be involved in. But Jake had been, and Mia could feel herself being drawn deeper into the tangled web he had woven without her knowing. One morning, while she was going through his office, something caught her eye, an old receipt tucked into a drawer in Jake's desk. It was for a hotel in a part of town Mia wasn't familiar with, a small, unremarkable place that had no business being on the radar. She couldn't think of any reason why Jake would have stayed there. He had never mentioned it, never spoken of any meetings in that area. Her heart started to race as she held the crumpled paper in her hands. What was Jake doing there? She decided to visit the hotel, hoping for some clue that might lead her to understanding what had been going on in Jake's life before his disappearance. The hotel was a grim, nondescript place. tucked away in a corner of the city that Mia had never ventured into before. It was quiet, almost too quiet, and the sense of unease settled over her the moment she stepped inside. The lobby was dimly lit, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell in the air. She approached the front desk, trying to keep her voice steady as she asked the clerk if he had any records of Jake staying there.